In the late Victorian era, provincial market towns like Northampton stood at the intersection of traditional rural life and the growing demands of modern commerce and industry. Within this world, Annie Pritchard, an unmarried woman of 31, travelling under a story of impending marriage and emigration, would soon become the central figure in a double murder case that shocked the public and entered the record as the Althorpe murder or East Haddon murder mystery. England in the 1890s upheld a strict public code of morality centered on respectability, marriage, and the sanctity of the family home. For women, especially those of modest means, social acceptance depended heavily on chastity, obedience, and a visible connection to legitimate male protection, a father, a husband, a brother. Pregnancy outside marriage did not simply invite gossip. It could mean loss of employment, expulsion from the parental household, and long-term social stigma. In such a climate, secrecy and deception often surrounded relationships that crossed the boundaries of respectability. At the same time, small businesses in towns like Northampton, grocers, butchers, and warehouse owners relied on male employees who were expected to be both hard-working and respectable heads of household. Men such as Andrew George MacRae, a married shopman with children, occupied a position that brought daily contact with goods, transport, and cash, but also exposed them to temptation and private entanglements that, if revealed, could destroy both livelihood and reputation. It is at the meeting point of these pressures, a vulnerable, unmarried woman and a married man fearful of scandal and financial responsibility, that the story of Annie Pritchard and Andrew MacRae begins to unfold. The surviving records place Annie Pritchard as a 31-year-old unmarried woman from Church Stretton in the county of Shropshire. She belonged to a modest provincial background in which a daughter's respectability was closely tied to her adherence to accepted moral norms and her continued presence within the family home. There is little detailed information about her education or early employment, but her later movements suggest a woman with enough independence to travel and to form relationships beyond the immediate oversight of her relatives while still being deeply affected by their expectations. At some point prior to 1892, Annie became acquainted with Andrew George MacRae while living in Warwick. There, the MacRae family and the Pritchard woman were neighbours, and a clandestine intimate relationship developed. Andrew MacRae was then a married man with a wife named Harriet and 2 young sons. He worked as a shop assistant, later employed in Northampton by his brother Edward in a grocery business. As a married tradesman with children, he occupied an outwardly respectable position in Victorian society, but one that depended heavily on the maintenance of a proper public image. When Annie became pregnant, the imbalance of risk between the two was stark. For MacRae, exposure of the affair threatened disgrace, domestic upheaval, and financial strain. For Annie, the consequences were even more immediate. A pregnancy outside marriage in a small-town environment could mean lasting dishonour and practical destitution. In this context, she told her family that she intended to marry a former suitor, Guy Anderson, and emigrate with him to America. The story provided a socially acceptable explanation for her departure and concealed the fact that the child she carried was, according to the later evidence, MacRae's. Guided by these arrangements, Annie left her home circle and came under MacRae's direct influence in Northampton, where he secured lodgings and medical assistance for her under various names and pretenses. By June 1892, she had given birth to a son, but her legal and economic position remained entirely dependent on a man who had every formal obligation elsewhere. That dependency, built on secrecy and deception, formed the immediate prelude to the events that would follow in July 1892. By early summer 1892, Annie Pritchard was living in or near Northampton under arrangements largely controlled by Andrew George MacRae. She had given birth to a son in June 1892, with MacRae presenting himself to the attending midwife under the assumed name Mr. Anderson. This use of an alias reinforced the impression that Annie was connected to a respectable fiancé matching the story she had told her family, while in fact concealing MacRae's identity and marital status. As the weeks passed, the situation became increasingly precarious. Annie was an unmarried mother with no independent means, effectively reliant on a married man whose own position, as a husband, father and shopman employed by his brother, depended on avoiding scandal. Existing sources do not provide a detailed record of their private conversations or any explicit threats. The available evidence does not precisely record what was said between them in July 1892. However, the subsequent events indicate the formation of a deliberate plan to remove both Annie and the child as sources of ongoing responsibility and potential exposure. Around 20th of July 1892, MacRae lured Annie and her infant son to a meat store and warehouse at 20 Dychurch Lane, Northampton, premises to which he had legitimate access through his employment. According to the findings later presented at inquest and trial, both mother and child were killed there by having their throats cut. The child's small body was then placed in the on-site furnace. Investigators would later recover fragments of burned bone consistent with an infant. Annie's body was subjected to further mutilation. Her head and part of at least one arm were removed, and caustic lime was applied in an apparent effort to hasten decomposition and obscure identification. The remains were wrapped in sacks bearing the name E. MacRae, Northampton, and transported by horse and cart out of town. They were then dumped in a roadside ditch along the Northampton Rugby Road near Althorpe railway station. For some days, Annie's absence did not immediately trigger alarm among her relatives, who believed she had gone away under the protection of Guy Anderson. Only on 6th of August 1892, when local workmen noticed a foul smell and discovered the sacks in the ditch, did the case shift from a private disappearance to a confirmed double homicide, prompting a full criminal investigation by the Northampton authorities. The formal investigation began on 6th of August 1892, when workmen noticed a strong stench coming from a roadside ditch along the Northampton Rugby Road near Althorpe railway station. On inspection, they found sacks containing human remains in an advanced state of decomposition. The body was incomplete. The head and parts of one arm were missing, and the surface of the remains bore signs of the application of lime, suggesting an attempt to hasten decay and frustrate identification. From the outset, one apparently minor detail shaped the direction of the inquiry. The sacks in which the body had been placed were marked with the name E. MacRae, Northampton. This marking linked the remains not to an anonymous offender, but to a specific local business. Police traced the sacks to the grocery concern operated by Edward McRae in Northampton. Questioning established that Edward's brother, Andrew George McRae, worked for him and had regular access both to the premises and to such packaging materials. At this stage, the police still needed to determine the identity of the victim. Comparison with reports of missing women, together with clothing fragments and personal effects eventually recovered or traced, led to the conclusion that the remains were those of Annie Pritchard, who had recently been associated with the McRae brothers in Northampton and who had not been seen for some time. The fact that Annie had arrived from Church Stretton on the understanding that she was to marry and emigrate, yet had now disappeared without credible forwarding address, added to the suspicion. Attention then shifted to the premises at 20 Dychurch Lane, a meat store and warehouse used in connection with the McRae grocery business. Neighbours and local residents reported that, around late July, an unusually strong and unpleasant burning smell had emanated from the chimney of the warehouse. When officers examined the interior, they found evidence consistent with the killings described at trial. Traces of blood, human hair, and charred bone fragments in or near the furnace, interpreted as the remains of the infant child. These findings suggested that the warehouse had been used both as a place of killing and as a site for partial destruction of the bodies. Further investigative work uncovered a pattern of conduct by Andrew McRae following Annie's disappearance. Witnesses recalled that he had been seen purchasing lime, a substance commonly used to accelerate decomposition, and hiring a horse and cart around the relevant dates corresponding to the likely transport of the body to the ditch near Althorpe. Other testimony indicated that he had sold or otherwise disposed of clothing and property known to belong to Annie, including a family Bible associated with the Pritchard household. These acts were viewed by investigators as attempts to erase physical traces of her presence and profit modestly from her belongings. Additional documentary evidence came to light in the form of letters. Some correspondence purporting to relate to Annie's movements and intentions was later characterized as forged or deceptive, designed to support the narrative that she had gone away respectably and thereby to delay or prevent inquiries into her true fate. Medical testimony from the midwife who had attended Annie's confinement in June 1892 under the name Anderson confirmed that MacRae had been physically present and involved in arranging her care, reinforcing the link between him, the mother, and the child. Taken together, the investigation assembled a chain of largely circumstantial but mutually reinforcing elements: a body disposed of in sacks bearing his family's name, a likely crime scene under his control, physical traces of burning and dismemberment, post-crime efforts to sell the victim's property, and preparations, lime, transport, forged letters, consistent with a deliberate plan to conceal a double murder. By the end of this process, the police theory of the case presented Andrew George MacRae as a man with motive, fear of scandal and financial responsibility, means, access to premises, tools and transport, and opportunity, thereby preparing the ground for the charges that would be tested before a jury at the Northampton Assizes. The case of Andrew George MacRae came before the Northampton Assizes in December 1892, presided over by a judge of the High Court on circuit. Proceedings opened on the 20th of December 1892 and continued for several days, attracting considerable local and national attention. The courtroom was reported as crowded with members of the public and press, following each development in what was already being referred to as the Althorpe murder or the East Haddon murder mystery. The prosecution's theory of the case was direct and uncompromising. Counsel for the Crown alleged that MacRae, a married shop assistant with a wife and 2 sons, had maintained a clandestine relationship with Annie Pritchard, resulting in the birth of a child in June 1892. Faced with the prospect of scandal, dishonour and long-term financial responsibility for an illegitimate child, he had, they argued, resolved upon a double murder. The Crown set out how he lured Annie and the baby to the warehouse at 20 Dychurch Lane, killed them by cutting their throats, burned the infant's body in the furnace, dismembered Annie, treated the remains with lime, placed them in sacks marked E. MacRae, Northampton, transported them by horse and cart, and finally tipped them into the ditch near Althorpe. To support this narrative, the prosecution called witnesses to establish each link in the chain. The medical witnesses described the condition of the recovered remains and the nature of the injuries, which were consistent with stabbing or cutting and subsequent dismemberment. The midwife who had attended Annie's confinement testified that MacRae had presented himself under the assumed name Anderson and had taken a leading role in the arrangements. Local residents and neighbours from Dychurch Lane spoke of the unusual burning smell and smoke from the warehouse chimney around the dates in question. Other witnesses confirmed that MacRae had bought lime, hired a cart, and sold or disposed of Annie's belongings, including her family Bible. The Crown argued that these acts could not be explained innocently when taken together. The defence, acting for MacRae, did not seriously contest that a violent crime had been committed, but sought to create doubt as to the identity of the perpetrator. They emphasised the absence of direct eyewitnesses to the killings themselves and argued that much of the Crown's case was circumstantial. Any man with access to the premises, they contended, could have committed the crime and used the sacks bearing the MacRae name in an attempt to divert suspicion. The defense also questioned the reliability of some witness recollections, particularly regarding dates and the interpretation of domestic smoke, and suggested that the sale of Annie's property might be capable of an alternative explanation not fully explored by the police. Nevertheless, the cumulative weight of the circumstantial evidence in the view of the court remained substantial. In his summing up, the trial judge carefully reviewed the testimony, directing the jury to consider whether the combined effect of the physical findings, the documentary trail, and MacRae's conduct before and after Annie's disappearance pointed convincingly to guilt. The jury retired to deliberate and, after approximately 2 hours, returned to court with a verdict of guilty of willful murder. MacRae was then formally sentenced to death by hanging, the execution to take place at Northampton Jail. He continued to protest his innocence, but under the law of the time and in light of the jury's verdict, no further legal obstacle stood between him and the carrying out of the sentence. Following the verdict at the Northampton Assizes, Andrew George MacRae remained in custody under sentence of death, with execution fixed for 10th of January 1893 at Northampton Jail. In the weeks between conviction and hanging, there is no substantial record of successful legal appeals or formal petitions achieving any alteration to the sentence. The legal framework of late Victorian England allowed for representations to the Home Secretary in capital cases, but there is no clear indication in the surviving material that any serious doubt at official level arose as to the soundness of the conviction. Press coverage in the months after the trial suggests that public opinion largely accepted the verdict as a just response to a particularly shocking double murder. Newspapers emphasized the vulnerability of Annie Pritchard, a single woman who had trusted a man already bound by marriage, and the fate of her infant child, whose remains were believed to have been burned in the warehouse furnace. The combination of illicit relationship, deception, dismemberment, and concealment of a body resonated strongly with Victorian anxieties about morality, respectability, and the sanctity of domestic life. The case came to be referred to in contemporary and later accounts as the Althorpe murder or the East Haddon murder mystery, titles reflecting both the rural location where the body was found and the enduring interest in the circumstances of the crime. However, in contrast with some other 19th century cases, there is limited evidence of a sustained, organized campaign questioning the conviction. While MacRae is recorded as protesting his innocence up to the end, his statements did not generate a major public movement for clemency or retrial. Over time, the case has been revisited primarily in the context of local history and studies of Victorian crime, where it is cited as an example of a domestic liaison ending in lethal violence and a rare instance of double murder involving both mother and child. Later commentators have noted the brutality of the method, particularly the dismemberment and disposal of the remains, but the surviving documentation does not reveal substantial modern doubt about MacRae's guilt, comparable to that found in recognized miscarriages of justice. The murder of Annie Pritchard and her infant son brought together many elements that troubled late Victorian society: a secret liaison, an illegitimate child, and a calculated effort to erase both mother and baby through dismemberment and concealment. The evidence against Andrew George MacRae was circumstantial but extensive, and the courts of the day had little hesitation in accepting it as sufficient for a death sentence. With what we know now, do you consider the verdict against MacRae to have been fair and well-founded, or do you see room for reasonable doubt? Was he simply a calculating killer seeking to protect his reputation, or also, in some measure, a product of the rigid moral expectations and social pressures of his time?